If the wonderful host here at St. Seton were to come in and say, you know, there's been a group of rogue Episcopalians seen out in the parking lot and they cut all your ignition wires. Apologies for any rogue Episcopalians in the audience. There would be this mad scramble for cell phones to try and call and make transportation arrangements. But there's one group of people that would be sitting here somewhat seguin. And that's the people who don't drive because they've already thought ahead and planned their transportation home. And this talk is all about what's going to happen when those rogue Episcopalians get hold of us. Matt? I don't know if you saw in the newspaper recently, there's this thing coming around on words that should be retired. And I think shovel-ready was taken off this year and some other words. Well, perfect storm probably should have gone a few years ago. Seems like every time there's a series of serious problems, we refer to it as a perfect storm, but wasn't creative enough to really come up with a better answer or a better phrase. There is seriously important changes coming about. And of course, today we're talking about the third of these, the aging of the baby boomer, and I get to claim membership as well. But there's a couple other things that may get here even sooner than that will impact the transportation. And you know, there's a little bit of a silver lining to this cloud because as we solve mobility problems for the greater population, it's going to help the seniors as well. In fact, more so than you might imagine. I'm not going to say much about climate change concerns. It's really not my area of expertise. But I think if you pay much attention to what's going on politically in this country and the rest of the world, there's growing concerns in that regard, and at some point in time, we'll see that begin to manifest itself in our transportation process. Fuel prices is something I have studied a little bit about, and I'll talk about more in a minute. Matt. As has been pointed out several times already today, this is a great place to be. And unfortunately, the statistics are beginning to point to the direction that that's going to take us. The Metropolitan Planning Organization, the group that was mentioned earlier, forecasts 62% growth in congestion over the next 20 years or so. So if you think the stoplights take time now and the traffic's bad, it's only going to get worse. As you've heard from the demographers, the population age 75 and up is the fastest growing in the group, among the fastest. And this was a statistic I turned up a few years ago. Americans, of course, according to a study in the Journal of Public Health, outlive their ability to drive about 10 years. And it's interesting, in the SAINT organization, where that's sort of our clientele, we can spot that typically the individual gives up their or loses their ability to drive. It takes them a year or two to finally wear out their kids and their friends. And maybe the last couple of years they're in assisted living and they don't need it, but there's a period of time in there, 7, 8 years long, which people can still be active, can still lead very healthy, productive lives, they just can't drive. And that's going to be an issue going on. Here in Larimer County, the medical community is vigorous, robust, and with total disregard for our community boundaries. So as a result, we have people who live in Fort Collins with their doctors are in Loveland, and people in Loveland who need to come to Fort Collins. And the social structure that we work with, our community and county organizations, don't necessarily connect as well as they should. There's progress coming, but right now it's a problem. And finally, just to kind of get into the weeds just a little bit, an awful lot of what we do here is funded by sales tax. Well, what happens in a recession? Sales tax go down. What happens when you order on the internet? You don't get the sales tax locally. It's a problem, and it's if you start talking about dedicated funding for anything, but particularly transportation, one of the first barriers you hit is the reliance on sales tax creates a problem. Right? Okay, a little bit more about the fuel prices. I have a background in the oil business with Conoco, and I've sort of followed it all along. The price of oil, I didn't check today, but for the last several days it's been hovering between $75 and $85 a barrel. Last year, or actually 2008, you remember it got up to about $140 a barrel, and oh my gosh, we were having all kinds of crises. Well, oil is a terribly fluid commodity, no pun intended, in that it flows all over the world. and wherever the demand is where it's going to go, and the price will follow accordingly. Now, there's not a uniform consensus yet as to whether we've hit the concept called peak oil. And peak oil, by the way, is not when you run out of oil, it's when supplies exceed, or demands exceeds supplies, which starts to create shortages, which starts to drive up the price. We may not be quite to that point yet, but everybody seems to agree that the price of oil is only going to go higher and higher. I was at a conference on peak oil down in Denver earlier this year, and one of the speakers was talking about this great new oil find they found off of Brazil. The water is 5,000 feet deep, and the oil is 5 miles below the bottom of the water. Yep, there may be some oil down there, but it's going to cost the proverbial arm and leg to get it up and put it in our fuel tanks. So whether we actually run out of oil or simply just have to start paying a lot more, I think we're going to find more and more that the travel by automobile is going to become increasingly problematic. Some people are banking a lot on natural gas. I hope so, being from that industry. But right now, those reserves aren't proven. They're believed to be there, but until the oil business actually drills them up and produces them. And then even if they have it, have you considered the cost of the infrastructure to bring natural gas vehicles to the road? Every corner down a busy street has a filling station, and every one of those filling stations would have to be converted to compressed natural gas. It's a very expensive proposition. If you've noticed, the city of Fort Collins is beginning to switch its bus fleet to natural gas buses. They've got the big hump on the top, that's how you can tell it. City of Loveland would like to do that, but they don't have a natural gas refilling facility at this point. So and that's just when you only need one, let alone when you need hundreds for the whole population. So there's lots of issues out there with that. Some of the folks that are doing analysis say that oil above 100 a barrel is going to be required before we can develop even what we know about. So all of that's a problem. There's a lot of talk about electric cars, and I was at a briefing on this recently, and somebody pointed out that's fine when you plug in your electric car, but when your neighbor plugs in his, you've just overloaded the circuits in the alley back behind your house. And so if we're really thinking that we're going to have distributed cars using electricity, then we have a huge infrastructure problem that's going to have to be overcome. So the bottom line of it is transportation is going to become more expensive and problematic as we go forward. Right. But there's some good news, and Gene was very careful saying, now don't get up there and scare everybody to death and quit talking. There are some things that are good. This year, this past year, City of Loveland and City of Fort Collins, for the first time, did a joint strategic transit plan. It's still lots of issues to be resolved, but it was a huge first step, and I salute both city councils for supporting and adopting that program. CDOT, Colorado Department of Transportation, has just formed its first ever division level of organization for transit and rail. In fact, I was in Denver yesterday at one of their advisory committees. That's very exciting because in the transportation business, no matter what you're talking about money. And CDOT is the big player money-wise in the state, and the fact that they're dedicating that kind of resources to that is excellent. By the way, one of our Fort Collins representatives, John Kafalis, was instrumental in helping set that up. One thing that's kind of fun, Amtrak is looking at returning train service to northern Colorado, and both cities of Fort Collins and Loveland have sent letters in encouraging them to bring the Pioneer train up through Fort Collins, Loveland on its way out to Seattle. It's still a bit of a stretch, but it would be kind of fun if you could go down here to the Burlington Northern Track somewhere and catch a train either bound for the west or bound to the east. High-speed rail is something you may have heard about that's under discussion. There was a major study for the last few years talking about, and when we're talking high speed, we're talking 150 miles an hour plus, the sort of thing where you could get a train somewhere in this area and be in Denver in 30 minutes. And that is still much of a dream. It's very expensive. But the fact that the state would put time and resources into it's encouraging as well. The federal transportation law that generates most of the monies that we get for highways and transit, it goes by the acronym SAFETY-LU, which is Safe Environmental Transportation, something or another.